Bow lower, girl, or let the king see what disobedience looks like. Lord Malcolm Greer's voice rolled through the grand hall of Black Hollow Estate, smooth enough for ceremony and sharp enough to make every servant lower their eyes. Sarah Whitmore stood at the center of the polished marble floor with her back straight, her old brown linen dress still damp at the cuffs from the laundry basin, her faded gray apron marked by soap water and herb stains, and her worn leather shoes leaving small wet prints beneath the gold chandeliers. Around her, nobles in velvet and silver watched with the hungry silence of people who enjoyed humiliation most when it could be called discipline. Isabel Greer stood near her father beneath the family crest, pale blue gown perfect, chin lifted, one white ceremonial napkin held between two fingers as if it had been touched by something unclean. She ruined the royal linen, Isabel said softly, making her voice tremble just enough for sympathy. On the night the Frost Crown Alpha comes to honor our house. Sarah looked at the napkin. One corner was stained brown with tea, but not from her hands. She had been in the laundry room when the cup spilled. She had heard Isabel snap at Tommy, the youngest hall boy, for holding the tray too low. She had seen the child freeze, seen the cup tilt, seen fear do what fear always did in places like Black Hollow. Make the smallest person responsible for the largest person's mistake. Now Tommy stood behind Sarah, hidden by the fall of her apron and the shadow of her skirt, trembling so hard she could feel it through the air between them. He was 11, maybe 12, all elbows and fear, with a silver cup clutched against his chest, as if letting go of it might make him vanish. Malcolm stepped closer. Bow to Lady Isabel. Apologize to this house. Then perhaps His Majesty will not have to witness how poorly our servants are kept. Sarah's hands tightened once at her sides. She could bow. She knew how. She had bowed to locked doors, empty plates, cold mornings, and names spoken without kindness. She had bowed when nobles passed, when stewards counted wages she never saw, when other servants whispered that an Omega with no family survived by staying small. But if she bowed now, Tommy would be seen. If she stepped aside, the blame would move to him because blame always rolled downhill until it found a child, an Omega, or someone too alone to refuse it. Sarah lifted her chin, not high enough to insult, only high enough to remain herself. I can clean the linen, she said. I cannot confess to a lie. A murmur stirred through the hall. Isabel's eyes flashed. Malcolm's mouth hardened. You forget your place. Sarah felt Tommy's small fingers catch the back of her apron. That fragile grip became stronger than fear. No, my lord, she said quietly. I am remembering it. At the far end of the hall, the great doors opened. Cold northern air swept across the candles, and every noble bowed at once as King Adrian Stormheart entered in black armor and a silver wolf cloak, tall, silent, and unsmiling. Every head lowered, every spine bent. Only Sarah remained standing, because a frightened child was behind her, and she was the only wall he had. The hall did not breathe after Sarah remained standing. Hundreds of candles burned in crystal branches above the marble floor, but the room felt suddenly colder, as if the north itself had followed King Adrian Stormheart through the doors and noticed every false bow at once. Nobles stayed bent, unsure whether lifting their heads would make them witnesses or accomplices. Servants pressed themselves closer to the walls. Lord Malcolm Greer froze with one hand half raised, his command trapped between ceremony and panic. Isabel's face sharpened with the first bright edge of alarm. Sarah could feel Tommy shaking behind her, his small fingers still gripping the back of her apron. She did not turn to comfort him. If she moved, the room would see him. If the room saw him too soon, Malcolm would find a way to make the child into proof of disorder. So Sarah stood very still, her damp cuffs cooling against her wrists, the scent of soap and rosemary rising faintly from her apron, and waited for the king everyone feared to decide what her dignity was worth. Adrian Stormheart did not speak at once. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. He was not a man who filled silence because silence made him uncomfortable. He let it stretch until every person in Black Hollow had to feel the shape of what they had been doing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, white-skinned beneath the pale northern cast of the chandeliers, his black armor marked with silver lines like frost on dark glass. A silver wolf cloak rested across his shoulders, heavy and immaculate, and his face was as unreadable as winter stone. People said the Frost Crown Alpha had not smiled since he became king. Looking at him now, Sarah believed it. There was no warmth in his expression, but there was attention, and attention was more dangerous to liars than anger. Malcolm recovered first with the careful desperation of a host trying to rescue a ceremony from truth. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing low, "forgive this offense. The girl is being corrected. She is a servant from the lower quarters, an Omega without proper training and court respect." Sarah heard the words lower quarters and proper training and felt them pass over old bruises in memory, not on skin, but in the places where a person stores every time they were told their life was smaller than someone else's comfort. She had lived near the laundry room for 6 years, in a narrow chamber where the window stuck in winter and the floorboards sighed whenever the wind moved under them. She rose before dawn to heat water, scrub linens, steep fever tea, polish serving trays, and mend uniforms for younger servants whose hands were still too clumsy for small stitches. She knew every hallway by the hour it became coldest. She knew which noble women wasted sugar in their tea and which footmen hid stale rolls for children who worked late. She knew Black Hollow from underneath, the way roots knew the dark beneath a flowering tree. Isabel stepped closer to her father. "She ruined the royal linen," she said, voice soft again, but thinner now, then refused to bow when told to apologize. Adrian's silver eyes moved to the stained napkin in her hand, then to Sarah's damp apron, then to the space directly behind Sarah where Tommy's breath trembled. He had seen. Sarah felt it before she understood it. The king had already seen the child. He simply had not given him away. "Is that so?" Adrian asked. Malcolm bowed again. "Regrettably, yes. She is stubborn, but useful when supervised." Useful. The word landed with a familiar weight. Sarah had been useful when an old cook needed her joints wrapped in warm cloth. Useful when Tommy cried the first night he was sent to sleep near the pantry. Useful when Isabel wanted lavender water, when Malcolm wanted polished silver, when every person in the house wanted labor without a name attached to it. But useful was not the same as seen. Adrian stepped farther into the hall, and the nobles remained bent as he passed them. His gaze did not leave Sarah. "And why?" he asked, voice calm enough to make the question sharper. "Is the only person standing in this room the one being accused of disrespect?" Malcolm's mouth opened. Isabel looked quickly at Sarah, then at the stained cloth. Sarah felt Tommy's grip tighten. She kept her voice low, steady, an American plane beneath all the northern grandeur. "Because I was told to bow to a lie, Your Majesty." The hall went utterly still. Adrian stopped a few feet away, far enough not to crowd her, close enough that she could see the pale frost pattern etched into the clasp of his cloak. "And what lie was that?" he asked. Sarah could have pointed. She could have accused Isabel, exposed Tommy, demanded justice like a flame finally finding air. Instead, she thought of the child behind her and chose the truth carefully. That honor is protected by blaming the smallest person in the room. For the first time, something shifted in the king's eyes. Not a smile. Not yet. But the cold around him changed shape, as if winter had found a reason to listen. The truth Sarah chose was careful, but careful truth could still cut through a room built on polished lies. Lord Malcolm's expression tightened, as if she had stepped beyond a line only he was allowed to draw. Isabel's fingers closed around the stained napkin, twisting the linen until the brown tea mark nearly disappeared beneath her grip. Around the hall, nobles remained bent in their bows, not because reverence held them there anymore, but because standing up would mean choosing where to look. King Adrian Stormheart looked only at Sarah. "The smallest person," he repeated. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the farthest pillar. Tommy's breath caught behind her. Sarah felt it against the back of her apron, light as a frightened bird. She kept her shoulders square, willing him to stay hidden one moment longer. Malcolm forced a thin laugh. "Your Majesty, servants often dramatize discipline when corrected in public. The boy she is shielding is also under house instruction. Both are harmless, but disorderly." There it was. The boy. He had found him. Tommy's fingers slipped from Sarah's apron as if shame had burned them. Before the child could step out alone, Sarah moved one half-step sideways, not enough to expose him fully, only enough to make it clear that if the room was going to see him, it would also see her standing with him. Tommy was small in his gray servant jacket, his sandy hair untidy, both hands wrapped around the silver cup like it was the last solid thing in the world. Adrian's gaze lowered to him, and something in the king's face sharpened without becoming cruel. "What is your name?" Tommy swallowed. "Tommy, your majesty. Did you stain the linen?" Isabel moved quickly. He startled when Sarah mishandled the tray. Sarah did not turn toward her. She looked at Tommy instead, softening her voice. "You can tell the truth. I am still here." The child's eyes filled, but he nodded. Lady Isabel was upset that the tea was not hot enough. "She told me to hurry. I tried, but the cup slipped when she reached for the tray." Isabel's face went white with anger wrapped in embarrassment. "He is confused." Adrian's eyes moved to the silver cup. "And Sarah?" Tommy clutched it tighter. "She caught the cup before it hit the floor. Then she put me behind her because Lord Malcolm said someone had to apologize before you came in." The hall seemed to lower around them. Sarah heard a servant near the wall release a shaky breath. She wondered how many had seen the same thing and hoped a child would be brave enough to say what adults had swallowed. Malcolm bowed stiffly. "A child's memory is fragile under pressure. So is a house's honor," Adrian said, "when it rests on frightening one." The words were so cold that even the candles seemed to stand straighter. Sarah felt Tommy lean closer, no longer hiding from her, but beside her. That difference mattered. Adrian turned to the stained linen. "Bring me the other ceremonial napkins." A maid near the sideboard looked to Isabel by instinct, then flinched when she realized the king had seen that too. Adrian's voice did not rise. "Look to me when I ask for truth." The maid hurried forward with trembling hands and placed a stack of clean white napkins on a silver tray. Sarah noticed one missing from the top fold, a narrow gap where the stained piece clearly belonged. Adrian compared them, then lifted his gaze to Isabel. This linen was never ruined. It was one napkin from a set, a replaceable inconvenience. He looked at Sarah and Tommy. "But you were prepared to make it a permanent shame." Isabel's lips parted, but no defense came. Malcolm tried again, quieter now. "We only wish the reception to be flawless." Sarah looked around at the bowed nobles, the silent servants, the child still trembling beside her. Then she spoke before fear could ask permission. "A flawless room can still be cruel." Adrian's eyes returned to her, and this time the shift was visible. The corner of his mouth did not move yet, but the frozen mask of the Frost Crown Alpha had met something warmer than flattery, stronger than obedience, and far rarer than ceremony. It had met a servant girl who would not trade a child's safety for her own survival. Adrian let Sarah's words remain in the air until every person in Black Hollow had to stand beneath them. A flawless room can still be cruel. The chandeliers glittered. The silver trays shone. The marble floor reflected bowed heads, velvet gowns, polished boots, and one servant girl in a damp brown dress who had said what no noble dared to name. Tommy stood beside her now instead of behind her, still frightened, still small, but no longer hidden like a mistake. Sarah felt the change in him through the quiet space between them. It was the difference between being protected by someone and discovering that protection could give you enough room to breathe. Lord Malcolm cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the girl has a talent for dramatic phrasing. It is one reason lower servants should not be allowed to speak during formal reception." Adrian turned his silver gaze on him. "And yet she has improved this reception more than anyone wearing a title." The sentence did not rise in volume, but it struck the room with royal finality. Isabel looked down at the stained napkin as though it might still rescue her, but it had become only cloth again, too small to hold the lie she had placed upon it. Sarah noticed a maid near the sideboard lowering her eyes, not in obedience this time, but in relief. Another young servant pressed a hand to her mouth. Malcolm saw them too, and his control began to tighten into something brittle. "Your Majesty, if every servant is encouraged to challenge household discipline, order will collapse." Adrian glanced at Tommy's silver cup, then at Sarah's stained apron, then at the line of servants along the wall. If order requires a child to shake and an innocent woman to bow to a lie, then it has already collapsed. Your house merely decorated the ruins. The cold in his voice moved through the hall like northern wind under a locked door. Sarah should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt the ache of all the years that had led to this moment. All the mornings before sunrise, all the apologies she made to keep peace, all the times she taught younger servants where to hide extra bread, how to warm their hands over laundry steam, how to cry quietly enough that no steward came looking for someone to blame. Adrian looked at her then, and somehow his attention did not demand performance. Sarah Whitmore, he said, using her full name as if it belonged in a royal hall. Did anyone ask for your account before ordering you to bow? Her throat tightened. No, Your Majesty. Did anyone ask the child? Tommy whispered. No, Your Majesty. Adrian gave a single nod to one of his northern guards. Record both answers. The scratch of pencil on paper began, soft but undeniable. Malcolm's face paled. Records will make this appear more serious than it is. Sarah looked at him, her voice quiet. It was serious before anyone wrote it down. The nearest servants heard her and went still. Adrian heard her too. For the first time, the edge of his expression changed, not into softness, not yet into the smile the court whispered he had lost forever, but into something almost like approval held behind winter glass. Isabel finally spoke, her voice thin. I only wanted the hall to be perfect. Sarah looked at the child beside her, then at the clean napkins stacked untouched on silver. Perfect for whom? No one answered. Adrian stepped toward the center of the room, and every noble bent lower without being told. But Sarah remained standing because he had not asked her to bow, and because Tommy was no longer behind her. The king looked across Black Hollow Estate, at its gold and marble and fear disguised as manners. Bring the servant records, he said. All housing ledgers, duty rolls, and disciplinary notes. If this house is proud of its order, it will not fear having it read aloud. Malcolm's hand tightened at his side. Isabel's face lost the last of its color. Sarah felt Tommy look up at her, and though the hall was still cold, she realized something impossible had begun. The king had not smiled yet, but Black Hollow had already started to tremble. The order to bring the servant records moved through Black Hollow like a candle flame passing under silk, small at first, then impossible to hide. A steward hurried from the hall with 2 northern guards behind him, and every noble who had been bent in ceremony slowly rose into a new kind of discomfort. No one knew what posture belonged to a room where the king had begun listening to servants. Sarah stayed where she was, Tommy close beside her, the stained napkin still visible in Isabel's hand, the silver cup still clutched against the boy's chest. Her legs ached from standing so still, but she did not shift. She had spent years making herself convenient, stepping aside, lowering her voice, swallowing the sharp edge of truth so meals could be served warm and linens could be folded straight. Now the truth had been invited into the center of the hall, and she was afraid that if she moved too quickly, someone would sweep it away before it took root. Adrian Stormheart stood a few feet from her, black armor quiet beneath the chandelier light, silver cloak resting like winter over his shoulders. He did not ask her to step back. He did not tell Tommy to stop trembling. He simply let the room adjust to the fact that the lowest people in it were no longer being rushed into silence. Malcolm tried to recover by turning toward the nobles. This is merely an administrative matter, he said, forcing a courteous tone. Black Hollow has always maintained order with generosity and discipline. A low sound came from the servant wall, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Everyone heard it. Malcolm's head snapped toward the sound, and several servants flinched. Sarah saw the old habit return instantly. Fear before punishment, apology before accusation, shrinking before the blow of a name. Then Adrian looked toward the servants, and his voice remained calm. No one will be corrected for reacting to the truth. The young maid who had made the sound covered her mouth, eyes shining. Sarah knew her. Lily, 16, assigned to candle trays and guest fires, often too tired to eat, standing up after midnight. Sarah had tucked bread into her apron more than once. The ledgers arrived in the arms of the steward, 3 leather books with brass corners and neat labels. Housing, duties, discipline. They looked so ordinary that Sarah almost hated them more. Terrible things became harder to challenge when written in tidy hands. Adrian opened the duty ledger on a polished side table. Read her name, he said. The steward swallowed. Sarah Whitmore. Laundry, linen repair, herb garden, lower kitchen, guest hall preparation, child servant supervision, night's sickroom rotation. Adrian looked at Sarah. All in 1 week. The steward hesitated. Most weeks, Your Majesty. Tommy whispered. She does my mending too. Sarah glanced down at him. Only because you tear elbows faster than anyone in the house. The words slipped out gently, almost by accident. Tommy gave the smallest breath of a smile. And then it happened. Adrian Stormheart looked at Sarah, at the damp apron, at the boy she protected, at the impossible tenderness still alive in her after years of being used, and the corner of his mouth lifted. It was not a court smile. It was not charming, not practiced, not meant for applause. It was brief, quiet, and real, like the first break of sunlight over snow no one believed would melt. The hall felt it before it understood. A noblewoman gasped softly. Isabel stared as if Sarah had stolen something sacred. Malcolm went pale. The Frost Crown Alpha had smiled for the first time anyone there could remember, and he had smiled not at beauty, not at power, not at praise, but at a servant girl who protected a child and still found room for kindness. Adrian's smile faded back into control, but its meaning stayed. Then this house has mistaken labor for loyalty and silence for consent, he said. Continue reading. Sarah looked down at Tommy's repaired sleeve, then at the ledgers opening one by one, and realized the smile had not saved her. It had done something far more dangerous to Black Hollow. It had believed her. The steward continued reading, but the hall no longer heard the ledgers as paperwork. Each entry became a window into the life Black Hollow had kept beneath its polished floors. Sarah Whitmore, Dawn Laundry. Sarah Whitmore, Guest Hall Linens. Sarah Whitmore, Herb Garden Frost Cover. Sarah Whitmore, Lower Kitchen Cleanup. Sarah Whitmore, Midnight Sickroom Watch. Sarah Whitmore, Correction for Speaking Above Station. Sarah felt Tommy look up at her at that last line, but she kept her face steady. She remembered that night. An old kitchen maid had been coughing so hard she could not stand, and Sarah had asked for a second blanket from the upper linen cabinet. Lord Malcolm called it overreach. Isabel called it presumption. The ledger called it correction. None of them had written that the old woman's fever broke before sunrise because Sarah stayed awake beside her with mint steam and a cool cloth. Adrian's silver eyes moved across the page. The brief smile was gone, but the room could not forget it had happened. It had cracked the myth of him more cleanly than anger ever could. The Frost Crown Alpha was still cold, still royal, still dangerous to anyone who mistook cruelty for order, but he was no longer unreadable. Sarah had reached something human in him without trying to reach for power at all. Malcolm seemed to understand that, and fear made his voice sharper. Your Majesty, every great house relies on internal discipline. A few unpleasant notes do not define Black Hollow. Adrian turned a page. Then the pleasant notes should be easy to find. The steward's hands trembled. There were none. Only duties, warnings, shortages, denied requests, and names of servants listed more often than any person could reasonably endure. Lily near the wall began to cry silently. Another footman stared at the floor as if the marble had become a witness against him. Sarah wanted to go to them, but she knew this moment needed her stillness. If she became only comfort again, the room might forget she was also evidence. Adrian looked at Tommy. Has Sarah protected other servants before today? Tommy nodded quickly, then remembered to speak. Yes, Your Majesty. She shares bread. She fixes sleeves. She takes the late sickroom shifts when someone is scared. Isabel made a small, bitter sound. So she is beloved by servants. That does not make her innocent of disrespect. Sarah finally looked at her. Respect is not proven by bowing to someone who is using a child as a shield. Isabel's cheeks flushed. Malcolm stepped forward, but a northern guard moved just enough to remind him the room had changed hands. Adrian did not raise his voice. Lady Isabel, you accused an innocent woman to avoid embarrassment. Lord Malcolm, you tried to turn that accusation into public submission. Now I find records suggesting this house has built its comfort on the exhaustion of those least able to refuse. He closed the ledger. The sound was soft, but final. Black Hollow Estate is placed under royal review. No servant records will be altered. No worker will be dismissed, relocated, or punished for speaking. Any attempt to silence testimony will be treated as defiance of the crown. The nobles stared as if the chandeliers had fallen without making a sound. Sarah felt the words move through the servant line like warmth under a door. Tommy's shoulders lowered. Lily wiped her face. The old cook in the back pressed both hands together, not in prayer exactly, but in the fragile shape of relief. Adrian turned back to Sarah. You were ordered to bow because this house feared what would stand if you did not. Sarah's breath caught. She had imagined many endings when the doors opened, shame, dismissal, hunger, another night in the laundry room with everyone knowing she had been made smaller. She had not imagined the king of the north naming her refusal as something strong. Adrian stepped aside, creating a clear path from Sarah to the servant wall, from the accused to the witnesses, from silence to speech. "Stand where you choose, Miss Whitmore," he said. Sarah looked at Tommy first. "With them," she answered. Then she walked across the marble, not away from the king, not toward the nobles, but to the servants who had watched fear become a record and truth become law. Behind her, Adrian faced Black Hollow with winter in his eyes, and no one in the hall mistook his calm for permission to lie again. Sarah reached the servant wall, and for the first time since she had entered the grand hall, she was not standing alone. Lily moved closer to her left. Tommy stayed at her right, still holding the silver cup, though his hands no longer shook as sharply. The old cook, Mrs. Harlan, stepped forward from the back with her gray hair pinned badly and her work apron dusted in flour, as if she had come straight from the kitchen before anyone could warn her to look smaller. One by one, the servants stopped pressing themselves flat against the walls. No one shouted. No one challenged the nobles. They simply became visible, and Black Hollow seemed less grand with every quiet breath they took. Lord Malcolm watched them gather with a look of disbelief that slowly turned into fear. He had ruled a house of whispers for so long that ordinary posture looked like rebellion to him. Isabel stood beneath the family crest, pale and furious, still holding the stained napkin like a ruined flag. "This is what happens," she said, voice trembling, "when servants are encouraged to forget gratitude." Sarah looked at the women who had scrubbed floors until their fingers cracked in winter, at the boys who carried firewood up 3 flights of stairs, at Mrs. Harlan who saved onion ends for soup and called it stretching supper so no child would hear the word hunger. Gratitude. The word sounded different when spoken by someone who had never missed a meal. Adrian turned toward Isabel, his silver eyes colder than the northern wind beyond the windows. Gratitude cannot be demanded from people being erased. A royal guard sealed the duty ledger with a blue cord and placed the crown mark across the knot. Another began taking names from the servant line, not as accusations, but as witnesses. Sarah watched Lily give her name in a voice so soft the guard leaned closer with patience instead of irritation. That patience almost undid Sarah. Small kindness could feel enormous in a place where every gentle thing had been treated as weakness. Malcolm tried to step toward the ledgers. "Those records belong to my estate." Adrian did not move, yet the guard nearest the table blocked the path with calm precision. "They describe people under my law," Adrian said. "You mistook possession for authority." Tommy looked up at Sarah. "Will they send us away?" She wanted to promise no one would ever be frightened again, but false comfort was still false, even when kind. So she crouched slightly, meeting his eyes. "They are asking our names now. That means they have to remember us." He nodded, as if that was enough to hold for the moment. Adrian heard her. Sarah knew because when she stood, his gaze had softened by a fraction no one else might have noticed. Then Malcolm made his last mistake. "Your Majesty," he said, struggling for dignity. "This girl has influenced the staff against their lawful superiors. She refused to bow, disrupted your reception, and now places herself at the center of a matter beyond her station." The hall waited for Adrian's anger. Instead, the king gave a quiet breath, almost like the memory of that first smile returning without amusement. "Beyond her station," he repeated. He looked at Sarah, at Tommy, at the servants now standing shoulder to shoulder. She stood where honor required someone to stand. Sarah felt the words settle over her like warmth from a fire she had never been allowed to approach. Adrian faced the court again. Effective immediately, Sarah Whitmore is under royal protection as a witness in the Black Hollow Review. She will not return to the laundry room unless she chooses to retrieve her belongings. She will not answer to Lord Malcolm, Lady Isabel, or any steward of this house. She belongs to no estate. Isabel stared at Sarah as if the floor had lifted a servant above her by mistake. Malcolm's mouth opened, but no sound came. Sarah did not smile. Not yet. The moment felt too sacred for triumph. She only reached for Tommy's small hand and held it gently, so he would know courage did not have to stand alone after it spoke. Sarah did not understand the full weight of royal protection until the room began to rearrange itself around it. The servants nearest her stood a little straighter, as if the words had lifted a ceiling they had been carrying for years. The nobles shifted back, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the distance they once used to separate themselves from the lower quarters no longer felt safe. Lord Malcolm's name still hung over Black Hollow Estate in portraits, contracts, and carved stone, yet the king's order had cut through all of it with one simple truth: Sarah belonged to no estate. She looked down at Tommy's hand in hers, small and warm, then released it gently so he could stand on his own. Courage needed comfort, but it also needed room to grow. Adrian Stormheart ordered the servant records copied under crown seal before sunset. Housing ledgers, duty rolls, meal accounts, dismissed complaints. Every page that had made exhaustion look organized would leave Black Hollow with his guard. Malcolm protested once, then stopped when Adrian looked at him. Isabel did not protest at all. She stared at Sarah with a pale, furious confusion, as if the world had broken a rule by allowing a servant girl to remain calm after being raised from shame. Sarah did not look away. She had spent too many years lowering her eyes so others could feel taller. "Miss Whitmore," Adrian said, and her name sounded different in his voice now, not softened, not possessed, simply honored. "You may retrieve your belongings from the laundry room. You may take someone with you, or go alone. Your choice." Choice. The word moved through her slowly. She had choices before, in small hidden ways. Save the last roll for Tommy or split it with Lily. Use lavender for the old cook's cough or keep it for the guest pillows. Cry quietly or not at all. But this choice was spoken in public, protected by law, and it made her hands tremble more than the accusation had. "I will go," she said, "but not alone." Tommy looked up quickly, ready to follow, but Sarah smiled faintly and touched his shoulder. "You stay with Mrs. Harlan." Then she looked toward Lily. The young maid's eyes widened. Then she nodded, wiping her cheeks with both hands. Together, they walked out of the grand hall, not through the servant side passage, but through the main doors Adrian's guards opened for them. Sarah felt every stare on her damp apron and worn shoes, but the marble no longer felt like a place that rejected her steps. The laundry room was colder than she remembered, or maybe she was seeing it without the habit of endurance softening the edges. A narrow bed against the wall, a cracked basin, a folded blanket too thin for northern nights, a cloth bag beneath the chair, holding everything that was hers, 2 dresses, a comb with missing teeth, a small bundle of rosemary, and the blue ribbon Tommy had once given her after she mended his sleeve. Lily stood in the doorway, crying silently again. "I thought you would be afraid to leave," she whispered. Sarah tied the bag closed. "I am." Lily looked at her. Sarah held the bag to her chest. But fear is different when it is walking beside a choice. When they returned to the hall, Adrian was waiting near the record table, still cold, still composed, yet the room seemed less frozen around him. Sarah stopped before him with her small bag in her hands. "There are others," she said. "In the East Wing. In the field houses. In the kitchens during winter banquets. Their names may not all be written." Adrian's eyes held hers. "Then we will listen where ink failed." Malcolm went pale again. Isabel turned away. Sarah felt the first quiet breath of something larger than rescue. The king's first smile had not ended the story. It had opened every locked room behind it. By twilight, Black Hollow Estate no longer sounded like a house preparing for royal celebration. The music had stopped. The polished laughter had disappeared. In its place came the steady scratch of pencils, the low voices of northern guards taking testimony, and the quiet courage of servants saying their names aloud without asking permission first. Sarah stood near the main doors with her small cloth bag in both hands, her old brown dress dry at the cuffs now, her faded gray apron still marked by soap and rosemary, her worn shoes planted on marble that no longer seemed too fine for her steps. Tommy stayed beside Mrs. Harlan, holding the silver cup properly this time, not like evidence, but like a child who had survived being blamed for fear he did not create. Lily gave her statement first, then the footmen, then the kitchen girls, then 2 field workers called in from the rain. Some spoke easily. Some could only whisper. Adrian listened to every voice as if the throne itself had become a place where the forgotten could be heard. Lord Malcolm stood under his family crest, smaller than the portrait above him. Isabel had retreated into silence, the stained napkin folded in her hands until it looked less like proof and more like a lesson she had not yet learned how to carry. When the first sealed box of records was carried outside to the royal carriage, Sarah felt Black Hollow shift behind her, not healed, not forgiven, but opened. That was enough for one night. Adrian approached her near the door, stopping a respectful distance away. "You do not have to leave before you are ready," he said. Sarah looked back toward the laundry corridor, the servant wall, the gold chandeliers, the room where she had refused to bow because a frightened child needed somewhere to stand. "If I stay tonight, they will spend the dark trying to make the truth feel smaller by morning." Adrian's silver eyes held hers. "Then we leave while it is still full-sized." Outside, the northern carriage waited under a sky washed clean by cold rain. Sarah paused on the steps. For the first time, no steward called her back. No bell demanded her hands. No voice told her to lower her head. Tommy ran forward before Mrs. Harlan could stop him and pressed the blue ribbon into Sarah's palm. "For your bag," he said. Sarah closed her fingers around it, feeling her composure tremble. "Keep standing," she told him. Tommy nodded hard. Adrian offered his hand to help her into the carriage, but waited until she chose to take it. The gesture was simple, and because it was simple, it felt sacred. Inside, Sarah sat by the window with her cloth bag on her lap, the blue ribbon tied around its handle. Adrian sat across from her, leaving space between them, his face once again calm as winter stone. Yet when the carriage began to move and Black Hollow's lights slipped behind the trees, Sarah saw the faintest curve return to his mouth. Not for the nobles, not for ceremony, for the servant girl who had stood when honor required it. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "why did you smile?" Adrian looked toward the road north, where mist curled between the pines and the first stars appeared above the dark hills. "Because every chord I enter bows," he said. "But tonight, someone finally stood for the right reason." Sarah looked down at the ribbon on her bag, then out at the road opening beyond the estate. Behind them, Malcolm sent a sealed letter in shaking handwriting to the old families, warning them that the Frost Crown Alpha had smiled for a servant girl and was asking for records. Ahead of them, the north waited cold and uncertain, filled with locked rooms, hidden names, and people who had forgotten they were allowed to stand. Sarah was afraid. Of course she was. But fear felt different now. It no longer told her to bow. It told her the road was real.